Definitely. Right.
Okay, guys, we'll get cracking. Is that a good time to start? I think we've got quite a few attendees on now. So we've got Dean Gillespie from ProPitch. We've got Ian Craig from ProPitch going to take us through building a fertiliser programme today. It's going to be quite, I suppose, short and basic to start with, but the key to these webinars are keeping them very interactive. So at the end, we really welcome questions, discussions and points. So please feel free to interact with the guys at the end and ask questions or make points. You can raise questions during the webinar by raising your hand or also typing in the question. We'll try and deal with them at the time. If we can't, we'll come back to them at the end. So the floor is for Dean and Ian to take away. Go for it, guys.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Right, so basically I'll start the presentation. Ian's going to take over. It's Ian's presentation. However, he's having internet problems at the moment, so I'm sharing the screen, and we're hoping we can kind of carry on going without any issues. I don't like presenting too much on other people's work, so hopefully Ian can carry on this way. So we'll just give you a bit of a brief introduction to what we do. Now get the slide to turn over, will be good. The ProPitch team is Ian, myself, Greg, and Graham. Graham and Greg come in as assistants as and when required, and basically Ian and I are the main pitch guys. And if we do need anybody else in, we tend to phone in the likes of Graham and Greg. And in fairness, they're fantastic. They understand exactly what we try to do, and they're there to support us all the way through, and the same kind of mentality as us as well, which probably idiots but enjoy work as well, but professional too. And I've always had to say, if you want to be the best, surround yourself with about the best, and without doubt, I've got some fantastic guys there with me. So you've got Ian, me, Greg, there we go, Graham. So just some of the services we do. It's sprint strategy, quality assurance, maintenance, design and construction, and educational and training. We will work hands-on with the ground staff, and that's part and parcel of what we do as well. I believe Georgie Palmer's on here as well. He does very similar by the sounds of it, mainly in the Spanish countries, but it'd be nice to catch up with you at some point over the next couple of days or weeks and see if we can work a partnership with you as well, mate. Some of the countries we've worked in, some of the clients, AFC, FIFA, UEFA, CAF, and the Indian Super League. As you can see, we're supported then with sports labs in some of these places anyway. Yeah, we're supported in with sports labs in some of these places as we've got satellite companies around the world. Neil can tell you pretty much where they are. Neil, are you there? No, he's going to mute. No worries. So we have also we got the app, and we use this app to kind of remotely manage the pitches, which is a unique sports turf management tool which provides managers, consultants, grounds managers, and the ability to manage sports pitch performance all year round. Enables grounds managers and consultants to perform assessments in the field from any mobile device, which is available on Android and also iPhone. So over to Ian.
Okay, thanks, Dean. Like Dean had said, I've been having some internet issues here, so unfortunately I'm not switching the webcam on, which is probably a good thing for everybody, but I'm not switching the webcam on just to try and take the pressure off a little bit, and Dean's gonna share the screen for me. So I do apologise if I drop out at any point, but it'll be seamless. You won't even notice. Dean will pick it up, and we'll crack on as much as possible. But as Dean says, like I say, a lot of our work is in supporting and looking to support clients and pitches organisations throughout the world. And one of the things that we very often are asked to do is provide assistance in building fertiliser programmes, which is something obviously that we're just going to focus on some of the basics of that today. And just if you see on that first slide there, I've put how much do I need to apply. Well, that's very often the sort of the big question. But what I'm going to do really is the way I would work is sort of take it back to the very basic steps at the beginning before we put together this plan and actually working out how much we need to apply. So if you click on Dean, the next screen. So first things first, obviously, is knowing your pitch itself. The groundsman, the grounds manager, knows better than anybody else how that pitch performs, what that pitch is needing. So we really need that sort of input. If you know the pitch, and it goes everything from the soil type, the weather conditions, the usage levels, grass type, and the actual expectations themselves. So depending on the level of pitch, you know, and the level of usage, the grass type, weather conditions, and the underlying soil, these play a huge role in what you're actually going to apply. But at the very beginning, when you're looking to put together a fertiliser, basically your input of nutrients over the next year, let's say, first step is always going to be the soil test. If you get a full spectrum soil analysis done, you know then what you've got there and where your deficiencies are. That then allows you to adjust your inputs to suit. You know, it's all well and good looking at previous records or looking at how somebody else does it or taking advice from people, but the most important thing is knowing what you've actually got and what you actually need before you move forward with it. So the first step is always get the soil test and see what levels you've got. Once you get these soil tests, it gives you a better idea then of what's needed and how you're going to go ahead and build that plan. If you can skip on, Dean, the next slide, please. The other thing as well, though, as well as using the numbers, as well as getting the lab to identify where you're lacking. Like I say, you as the grounds manager, you as the grounds person, nobody knows that site better than you. So if you see something isn't right, if you can identify what's actually wrong, it gives you a better idea again of what you need to apply. You know if your pitch isn't performing, if the colour's not right, if the density isn't there. So you need to be able to identify where the problem actually lies. Like I say, the soil test is very, very important, and that it will identify your nutrient levels, but using your eyes is equally important. And basically each deficiency in different nutrients, they all display different symptoms, and quite often they can be quite similar, but it gives you, if you know what you're looking for, it gives you a better idea of where to start in order to actually rectify this. Now, I'm going to go through a few of the nutrient deficiencies and just I mean, I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here, but just really as a bit of a refresher. Like I say, we're going back to some of the basics of nutrient deficiencies here and just what to look for. Obviously, nitrogen being the big one. It's the main building block of your plants, your proteins and amino acids. If you don't have enough nitrogen, it's as simple as the turf appears to be very, very yellow. You don't get that growth. There's a severe lack of growth, and that's generally the first place you're going to look, is to put some nitrogen on it, see if that fixes the problem. Next, again, I'm going to do these in sort of in order of, in my opinion and in most people's opinion, I'm sure, importance. Phosphorus being the next one, and again, it's a little harder to identify, and you don't, especially if you're looking at sort of natural soil rather than a sand-based root zone. You don't necessarily often see a phosphorus deficiency, but we're dealing very often in a sports construction, a sand-based root zone, which is generally very sterile and doesn't have a huge amount of nutritional value. Phosphorus is one that you will tend to see, and it's important in establishing your pitch. Again, if we're dealing with high-end pitches that are generally looking at a new surface and establishing from seed every year, the phosphate becomes critically important. You do tend to see stunted growth, which again could be applied to a number of different nutrients, but with the phosphorus, the key thing to look for is that sort of reddish purple tint that you see around the leaf tips. Generally, that is an indication of a phosphorus deficiency. And again, when you're looking at phosphorus, there may well be some phosphorus, and this is where it becomes important that you use your eyes rather than the soil test as well, or use a combination of the two. But a soil test will tell you how much phosphorus is actually available. Phosphorus itself is relatively immobile in the soil when temperatures are low. So in the springtime, you're looking at low soil temperatures. Quite often there may well be phosphorus reserves in the soil. With it being sort of relatively immobile when it's cold, you do tend to see that that deficiency symptoms in the plant, in which case you may look to implement some kind of foliar phosphorus application if that's available to you, just to give the plant what it needs at that early stage of the year. But the critical thing you're looking for with the phosphorus is that purpling reddish tint to the leaf tips. That's usually the key indicator in most cases of a phosphorus deficiency. Okay, Dean. Potassium, again, that's the third of the big three, the macro nutrients really. Potassium, you tend to see it's very important in sort of cell wall formation and moisture regulation within the plant. Generally, lacking potassium, the plant is very lacking in sort of stress tolerance in general, but the most common one, or the one we're most likely to see the onset of, is drought tolerance. So if your potassium levels are low, then there's a good chance that the drought tolerance of that plant is going to be particularly low. Again, if you're having to water, if you're checking moisture levels, if you're keeping your moisture levels where they need to be, but you're still seeing signs of drought symptoms, or very quickly exhibiting drought symptoms, the chances are you've got a potassium deficiency. Again, you could be applying some potassium, or get a soil test and just double check these things. It's just giving you an idea that the key indicators to look for before you go ahead and apply.
Okay.
Calcium, again, one of the more commonly applied nutrients. It's in a lot of the fertilizers, it's in a lot of the granular fertilizers and foliar and liquid feeds that are out there. Again, if you get that imbalance, you have an imbalance in calcium, again, you're looking at stunted growth, and particularly a stunted root system, which again, when you're trying to establish from seed, the root system's critical in establishing those roots as early as possible. Is a critical part in establishing your turf. So if your calcium levels are low, again, you're going to get that stunted root development, which in turn is going to cause you some serious problems in terms of traction and stability of the surface. The other thing to look for is chlorotic yellowing of the leaf tips. Again, this is quite a common one. You'll see that with a lot of nutrient deficiencies, that chlorosis. This is where it's important that we have not only that understanding of what we're looking for, but also the soil tests, so that we can identify where this deficiency is. Next, Dean.
Yeah, sorry.
There we go. Magnesium, again, it's sort of critical in the chlorophyll development within the plant. You put down your fertilizers that contain, a lot of the granules these days contain magnesium oxide. It's not uncommon to see sort of foliar magnesium applied, and you get that green up effect that you without getting necessarily a flush of growth, and it's simply because the magnesium plays a critical part in the development of the chlorophyll within the plant. So if you have a magnesium deficiency, you very often see this intraveinal yellowing. It's a sort of striping effect within the plant. Again, it can quite often be confused with an iron deficiency, which we'll come on and talk about as well. But again, like I say, you can combine the two. You could be applying iron but still having that yellowing, because iron is obviously a common one that we all apply for the green up. The chances are, if you're still getting that yellowing, as potentially that magnesium deficiency there. So we need to top that up. Sulfur. This is very similar actually to nitrogen, and again, it's very often seen in the younger leaves, certainly before the older ones, but it's a sort of critical part in the development of a sward when you're developing from seed. So again, if you're applying nitrogen but still getting that that yellowing, or not getting the effect of the nitrogen that you think you should be getting, the chances are that what you want to look for is, again, back to your soil test. What are my sulfur levels like? Do I need to top up them? Do I need to top up that sulfur? Because it's, like I say, it's very similar effect. Very often the first thing is we'll just throw down a fertiliser, we'll throw down nitrogen, but you're not necessarily going to get that response you want if you're lacking in other nutrients. So like I said, sulfur, the symptoms can be very similar to nitrogen, but it's worth knowing it's an important micronutrient, again, in the development of the plant. Iron, and again, we've covered it really, but very similar to magnesium. Particularly in sort of more alkaline soils, we tend to see more iron deficiency. But it's quite a commonly applied foliar product, and it does give you that similar effect to the magnesium. It gives you that green up, and again, it's just due to the important role that the iron plays in the sort of chlorophyll production of the plant. But again, can be very, very easily confused, an iron deficiency with the magnesium deficiency. So again, if you're getting that yellowing, but you think your nutrient inputs are where they should be, refer back to that soil test and check what your iron levels are and your magnesium levels are. Chances are, if you're getting that yellowing, certainly that sort of striped yellowing, intravenal yellowing, there'll be a deficiency of either iron or magnesium. Again, it's important that we understand what's actually in there before we just apply products for the sake of it. We want to make sure we're getting the most out of our products. We're getting we're spending our money where it needs to be spent. So again, if we understand what we're looking for in terms of nutrient deficiencies, and in terms of reading a soil analysis report, it allows us to build that fertiliser plan in a more informed manner. It's not just throwing products at it and hoping that it goes green. Just really to sum up in terms of micronutrients, if anybody out there can tell me what a boron or a molybdenum deficiency looks like, then I'm all ears. You can take the floor, because I'll be perfectly honest with you, in 20 years of doing this, I've still never seen a boron deficiency on a football pitch. It's there in very trace amounts throughout your fertilizers. Most of what you're applying does have these sort of very trace amounts of these trace elements. But if I'm being perfectly honest, and some might call me a bit cynical, I've still never seen a boron or a molybdenum deficiency, and quite frankly can't tell you what it looks like. So it sort of, for me, sums up the importance, if you know what I mean. We've got to prioritise. We've got to sort of understand what we need to be focusing on, and all too often I think there's a little bit too much science put into these things. There's a little bit too much focus on some of the things that aren't as important. And if we get those macros and the more important micronutrients, if we get those inputs spot on, then it's most of the battle. I would also highlight at this point, while we're talking about soil testing and nutrients, nutrient usage and availability, I'd never underestimate the importance of pH. It's one of the first things I'll ask when I see a deficiency in something. Can't always tell what it is. Like I say, a lot of these are very similar. If I see that a pitch is deficient in something, one of the first questions I always ask is, what's your pH? And the reason I ask this is, if you look on the the slide at the moment, if you look at that chart again, I'm sure everybody's seen this in the past. The majority of pretty much every one of those nutrients that we've covered here, between 6.5 and 7.5 is that optimum range. It's the optimum range for nutrient availability and nutrient uptake. Some of these, some of them, again, I mentioned iron. If you're particularly alkaline, iron availability becomes low. Again, the more acidic the soil is, the iron availability is high. Magnesium goes the opposite way. But if you look at that 6.5 to 7.5 range, again, we're in the optimum for your iron and your magnesium. So when you're looking at your nutrient inputs, one of the first things you should be looking at is the soil pH, because if you're in that range, then these nutrients are generally all available. These nutrients are, if you are deficient in something, then when you apply it, you should see the benefits of that. However, if your pH is too low or too high, doesn't matter. If you've got a low pH, doesn't matter how much magnesium you're applying. A lot of the time you're wasting your money because it's not available within the soil when it's strongly acidic. And you know, the opposite can be said about iron and manganese, for example. If you're strongly alkaline, you're going to see deficiencies in them. So if you can keep your pH buffered, you know, quite often applying something just to maybe make the soil slightly more acidic or slightly more alkaline, you'll get a reaction as if you've applied a fertiliser, because what happens is you're freeing up that nutrient that's been locked up in the soil, that stuff that's been unavailable because of the pH. Next slide, Dean. Thanks. And similarly, just looking at some of the cool season grasses here. I don't know if we've got any warm season guys on at the moment. I'll apologise if we do, but these are just focusing on the cool season grasses. But again, looking at the ones that we are generally dealing with in a sports pitch. In a cool season, your perennial ryegrass and your smooth stalk meadowgrass, or Kentucky blue, we're looking there around that 6.5 to 0.5 being the optimum range for these turf grasses. So again, and overstress the importance of making sure that pH is balanced. If you've got the pH where it needs to be, you're facilitating, you know, growing these grass species. You're facilitating getting the best out of these fertilizers that you can get. So it's every bit as critical as the actual nutrient levels themselves as the pH. It's just worth bearing that in mind as we sort of as and when we look to build that fertilizer program. Okay, Dean. So the sort of basics again is I suppose when we're looking to put that plan together is what are we actually trying to achieve? Well, we're all trying to achieve that healthy turf. We want adequate growth, which is going to generally, as a general rule, we want that sort of consistent growth throughout the year. We want to maintain that turf at a healthy level. We do, however, and particularly when we're talking about sports pitches, we do have to make sure that we have enough in reserve, not just to have steady growth. We need to be able to get, as and when we need them, flushes of growth in order to recover from damage if it's a heavy usage schedule or matches played in poor conditions. This can have a very sort of detrimental effect on the turf health itself. So we need to have that nutrient available there to accelerate that recovery. We also need to try and minimize stress as much as possible, give the grass the best possible chance of tolerating that stress, as well as minimizing the disease pressure. And a lot of that comes down to getting your inputs accurate. Now, that's not to say keeping them low or keeping them high. It's making sure it's accurate, because you have some turfgrass diseases, and particularly if you're dealing in a stadium environment, which is not a natural environment for grass to be growing, you have diseases that are brought on by a lack of nutrition, weakness in the plant, but you also have diseases that can be brought on by too much nutrition. You have too much sort of lush growth at the top. You know, your fusarium, for example, it loves it. So sometimes you'll find if your nutrition levels, particularly if your nitrogen levels are too high, you'll look at getting fusarium, whereas we may be looking at things like red thread if the nutrient levels are low. So it's important that we get them absolutely accurate. And again, it can be a very broad statement. It can be a very broad spectrum of what you actually need to apply. And again, it comes back to the very first slide where I've said, as long as you know the site, as long as you understand what you're dealing with, you know nutrition levels, you know your soil type, you know your usage levels, conditions. If you know all of these, it gives you the better information. It allows you to sort of better make a more informed decision as to what fertilizers you actually need to apply and when. So moving on, very, very basic diagram I've got here of nitrogen uptake. Again, I'm not going to go too in depth into this, but we can refer back to this if the session, I think, is being recorded, so we can sort of refer back to that. But it gives you a bit of an idea of what goes on within the soil when you apply these fertilizers. I'm going to go on and just talk a little bit about various different types of fertilizer and how they work. So just looking at this basically as your sort of breakdown, you've got, you know, your four main nitrogen sources. That's your organic, ammonium, ureic, and nitric nitrogen. Well, they all react differently. They all interact with the plant and the soil differently. So again, having a better understanding of how these are broken down, how these are taken up by the plant, gives you the information you need to make that decision. What am I looking to achieve from this fertilizer application? Do I want, you know, sustained growth over a long period, or do I want a flush of growth? I need to recover from a match. I want a flush of growth. What kind of granular fertilizer do I need to apply? So we'll move on from that. Like I say, I'll not go into too much detail there, Dean. We'll talk a little bit about granular fertilizer applications. And as a general rule, your granular fertilizers are broken down into kind of three different types. If you skip on, Dean, your slow release granules tend to come from sort of more complex forms of nitrogen. As I said previously, your organic nitrogen compounds or your or more complex molecules like methylene urea, for example, which in themselves don't act as the fertilizer, but when they go down into the soil, get broken down by your aerobic bacteria in the soil. They get broken down into a form of nitrogen that can get taken up by the plant, can get utilized, and generally, if you have a well-drained, well-aerated soil with a decent bacterial life, you put down these slow-release fertilizers, you'll generally get a sort of sustained release of nutrient, release of nitrogen to sort of sustain a relatively consistent growth levels. We also have your controlled release nitrogen, which would tend to be coated granules, or compounds such as polymer sulfur that coat these granules. Again, the nutrient themselves are held within the granule, but with adequate temperature and adequate moisture, these coatings will tend to break down and release the nitrogen again over, or release the nutrient over a longer period. Again, it requires adequate temperature and adequate moisture. These products are generally very good. You can put them down, and if the conditions aren't right, they will just sit there. They'll stop releasing the nutrition. If the grass isn't growing, these products aren't releasing the nutrient, so it's not been wasted. It's not been broken down and leached out of leached out of the soil. And then we've got the conventional release fertilisers, which tend to be your more basic nitrogen compounds from your urea ammonical and ureic ammonical and nitric, which again, if we'll look back at the slide about the sort of the simplified nitrogen in the soil slide, if you look back at that, you get an idea of how these fertilizers work. So when you're applying products with a high level of ammonium, high levels of nitrate, these are instantly available for the plant. These are instantly available to be taken up by the plant. So generally your quick release fertilizers, the ones that you're looking to apply to get that flush of growth, will be predominantly ammonium or nitrate, whereas your urea tends to need that little bit of breakdown into ammonium before it can be taken up by the root. If you go back again, Dean. Thanks. Yeah, so generally, if we're looking to get that flush of growth, if we're looking for that recovery or looking to kick the turf on, get it that sort of shot in the arm, we're looking at these conventional release granules. And again, if you skip on to the next slide, Dean. If you know, again, and when planning ahead, if you know what you're looking for from these fertilizers, like I say, you tend to find that the controlled and the slow release products will be used as a base feed. They're sort of drip feeding the nitrogen through the growing season. You're getting that sort of consistent growth, but you still need to use these conventional release granules in order to get that flush, in order to get that recovery, or kick on seedlings, these type of things. So provided you know the actual source, so rather than when we look at a bag of fertilizer, it always gives us that NPK breakdown and then obviously the micros underneath. And while that's good information and it lets us understand sort of quantities of nitrogen that we're applying, it lets us understand how much we're using. It's important that we actually look at the nitrogen derivation itself, so we need to know what type of nitrogen we're putting down, i.e. what kind of response am I going to get. If I need an instant response, if I'm looking to kick that turf on, I'm not going to put down methylene urea or a polymer sulfur coated product. I'm going to put down something that's ammonium, that's nitrate, that's going to get that kick as quickly as possible. But also, I'm not going to put down one of these products as a base feed. There is uses for all types of these fertilizers. We just need to know when to utilize each one. So another one that we'll just touch on as a sort of a top up to your granular fertilizers. Again, when you're dealing with a sort of high-end football pitch, particularly on a sand-based root zone, you're always going to need these granules, as the sand itself is relatively sterile. It's not really a particularly good growing medium in terms of nutrient availability, so we do need to put down these granules. But on top of these granules, what we also do is apply liquid and foliar fertilizer. If you skip on, Dean. Now, I'll clarify from the start, because it's something that quite often gets sort of overlooked or confused, is that just because you're putting down a liquid feed doesn't mean you're putting down a foliar fertilizer. All foliar fertilizers are liquid form when you apply them. Simple as that. You spray them onto the leaf, but not every liquid fertilizer you're applying is a foliar feed. So if you go to the next one, Dean. With a foliar feed, a true foliar feed, they tend to be formulated with sort of surfactant and additives to aid in the foliar uptake of the nutrient itself, actually allow the fertiliser to be taken into the plant. So true foliar feed, always put down in a low water volume and the finest spray quality. Generally, what you're looking to do is coat the leaf and then let that product dry onto the leaf and be taken up by the plant. We want to minimise the actual runoff itself. There's no point putting foliar feeds down and 800 litre a hectare nozzles. You're going to waste most of that. And the critical thing you need to know about your foliar fertiliser versus just a standard liquid feed is it's a relatively small amount of nutrition that goes into your foliar fertilisers, because you need it just to be taken up straight away by the plant. So anything that goes into the soil is effectively going to be wasted. But by foliar feeding, what you're doing is you're eliminating the potential for that leaching or locking up in the soil. You're just feeding it directly onto the plant. But we need to make sure that we understand the difference between a true foliar feed and what is effectively liquid fertiliser. So next slide, Dean. So again, like I say, the liquid feeding, you'll tend to use a higher water volume and higher levels of nutrition as well. You maybe be putting down a liquid feed at a similar or slightly lesser rate, but generally than a granule, but generally far higher than a foliar feed. You may apply with a liquid or a granular. You might be applying 30-40 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, whereas with a foliar feed you're only applying 2, 3, 4, but it's going directly into the plant. It's being utilised straight up, whereas with the liquid feeding, again, you might get some degree of foliar uptake, but a lot of what you're putting down is just going down into the soil, and it is, again, readily available. They're very good for getting that flush of growth again with a liquid feed, because as you put that down, it's already solubilized, it's already in solution, it's easily taken up by the plant, or it's easily broken down by the soil microbes and then utilised by the plant. So as with the foliar feeding and granules and liquid, if you take everything together, as long as you understand what you're trying to achieve by this application of fertilizer, it'll give you a better idea what you actually need to apply at the time. And if you go on, Dean, next. And basically, yeah, just in conclusion, depending on budget and resource, depending on what you're actually looking to achieve, if you can get a good balance of granular fertilizer, but also a good balance of the different types of granular fertilizer, also be topping that up with liquids and foliar feeding. And again, just depending on what you're actually trying to achieve, it does always come down to the skill and the knowledge of the grounds person to actually decide what and when to apply. But you need to understand if you need to apply it and what you're trying to actually achieve from that application, because generally, if you don't get them right, you're going to have weak turf. It's not going to perform right. It's not going to perform the way it's supposed to. You're going to lose matches. It's as simple as that. So yeah, just really to sum it up, without the correct inputs, we're going to end up with poor turf and the matches off. Simple as that. So as that's pretty much all I've got to say, and I know a lot of that may have been some sort of quite basic information there, but I think it's important that we sort of quite often just refresh that and take a look at the sort of very first steps, the most basic steps in what we need to do before we put together that fertilizer program. So, I mean, open things up to the floor really. If anybody's got any questions or anything they want to add, please feel free.
There's a couple of questions just come through. Firstly, I just want to say thanks to Lee Jackson for finally joining us on that last slide. He just sent me a text message now as that last slide was coming through pretty much. So it's Steve.
Hi, Lee.
That might have been our fault for not accepting the registration because he came in a bit late, so it's not Lee's fault.
I don't blame you. I wouldn't accept his registration either. There's a couple of questions come through. Please tell me which chemical can be used to control weeds.
Which chemical can be used to control weeds? That depends entirely on the weed. I would say glyphosate. That will control every weed, but no, I mean it depends entirely on the weed. If we're talking about broadleaf species, you know, generally your sort of more common 2,4-D, dicamba, mecaprop type products will tend to control broadleaf weeds in a grass sward. Those would be the sort of main ones, but again, it would generally be, if I'm going to be product specific, I would need to be weed specific. I would need to know exactly which weed we're dealing with in order to sort of recommend a product to control it.
Yeah, and there's another one that's come in now. Ferrous sulfate is suitable for hybrid Bermuda grasses? Question mark.
Sorry, say that again, Dean.
Ferrous sulfate, is it suitable for hybrid Bermuda grass?
Yes, I don't see why not. I think in the right application, Dean. I mean, if you have any thoughts, I've certainly plenty ferrous sulfate on Bermuda grass in the past.
Yeah, I'd do a trial area first. I wouldn't check it on straight away. I mean, I'd be a bit concerned about what it could do if it was applied correctly. Late at night, maybe before or just before the sun setting, rather than middle of the day. Yeah, so I can't see why not. Yeah.
Yeah, I think when it comes to if you're talking about Bermuda grass, obviously it's going to be a warm climate. The general advice with any kind of fertilizer application would be to try and do it early morning or late night and make sure that it's not being done in direct sunlight, because there is always that potential for scorching, especially with things like ferrous sulfate, which I don't have a problem with using on these species. If you do use it in sort of direct sunlight, yeah, there's potential for scorch because the sunlight can be intense. You also have the potential for, when it's as hot as that, the sort of volatilization. You'll lose a lot of the product before it actually hits the plant. It sort of evaporates into the atmosphere. So, you know, with Bermuda type climates, certainly early morning or late at night is the best approach for applying these products.
I'm just going to unmute a couple of the guys as well. I don't know if you want to ask questions. I know
whatsoever, no blood. There was no sign that Redhill Farm had been the scene of any serious assault. There was no sign of a cleanup. So whilst our efforts were directed at obtaining forensic evidence, those efforts ultimately proved completely fruitless.
Jack, we're watching TV. Is he asking a question?
I'm not qualified to answer that question, I don't think.
What was the question? Jackie, you watch the TV in the background. What do you weird stuff. Jackie, do you have a question? Anybody else have a question? Blair, you there?
Dean, I've got one, right? Can you hear me?
Yes, we does.
Right. Obviously, just when you were talking about expectations, obviously I'm working at a lower end of the industry than your top level stadiums. With regards environmental impact of putting fertilisers down, whose responsibility do you think it should be to take it upon themselves to reduce the amount of fertilisers put down with regards to environment? Because obviously, is it fair to put it on the head groundsman who's only trying to safeguard their job? Like, should more guidance come from above, be it Grounds Management Association or whatever, to be realistic about the level of surface you should be looking to achieve?
It's a good question. I mean, I think you've got to look at it as well as a head groundsman. You've got to apply what your plant needs. You just don't keep on chucking it down just for the sake of it, because obviously it doesn't do much good for the environment when it does go through the drains and things. Who's responsible? Good question.
Because turkeys don't vote for Christmas, you know what I mean? So it's, but at the same time, there's all these things in the news about environment, so it's hard.
Yeah, I know there are products out there that will hold the nutrients within the soil, so you don't get so much leaching anyway. There's a couple of suppliers online that that'll have products such as that. There are different kind of products you can use that can retain some of the nutrients in there. You don't want to be chucking on too much. You want to chuck on what you want to use sometimes, what you're using, But yeah, you do get leaching as well, so it is a bit of a tough one.
I think as long as you can be shown to be sort of responsible in your inputs. I mean, I know I've sort of where drainage water itself is actually, I guess, filtered through maybe reed beds or whatever to actually sort of take out any potential nitrates that are going to leach into any groundwater. I think provided you show due care and attention to these things, you're not just throwing it on willy-nilly and not caring where it goes. I think everyone understands that a football pitch, for example, does need additional it does need to be fertilised more than just a park or whatever. I think as long as you're not completely ignoring that, you are acknowledging and doing what you can, you are trying to mitigate that sort of contamination of groundwater. I suppose the grounds manager, that would be your responsibility. I think there'd be no shying away from that if you hadn't taken that sort of integration. But I think that there has to always be that understanding that we are going to be applying an awful lot of fertiliser in the sports turf industry. That's as simple as that. Otherwise, we don't have a sports turf industry,
Yeah. Are you comfortable with that, Blair?
Yeah, cheers.
Yeah. There's also a question about after watering on the ground fertiliser application. Is after watering on ground fertiliser, is it right to apply water after applying fertiliser?
Well, yeah, and if we're talking about, let's say, a granular fertiliser, we don't want that. The target for that is the soil. So yeah, I would always say after a granular fertiliser application, yeah, we want to water. If it's a foliar fertiliser application, then you need that product to dry on the leaf, for example, in order for it to be taken up. So no, obviously you don't want to be watering after you've applied. But again, that comes down to the planning. First and foremost, do you have an irrigation system? If so, when you apply your granular fertiliser, yeah, it needs to be watered in, because the target is the soil. So we want to get it watered down into that soil. Dean, to add to that?
Just checking. No, sorry, I've been kind of like thrown in between because somebody's just come in and do a little bit of work for us as well. So let's get another question. Martin Parish, when applying foliar feed, in your opinion, what percentage of product is entering the plant, and how much do we lose evaporation if washed off?
Okay. Well, again, that all comes down to the product itself and the actual, I suppose, your equipment. There are some very good nozzles specifically for foliar feeding these days. If you get the sort of, again, I would always refer to label recommendations. They tend to be tend to be pretty accurate in terms of what you're applying. I think if you follow all the recommendations and you do have, for example, a 4-hour window after foliar feeding to let the product dry and then be taken up, you probably get a high proportion of it taken in. But then if you apply and it rains half an hour afterwards, there's a good chance you'll lose a lot of that into the soil.
Sorry, just to go on that, studies have actually proven that within 15 minutes of applying foliar feed, the plant will absorb up to 70% of that foliar application.
Yeah.
You obviously, that's for what lands in the leaf. What misses the leaf, and if it rains, then it'll just wash straight through. But what actually lands in the leaf within 15 minutes, 70% of that plant actually is taking up some of the nutrients, so it's pretty good. It doesn't react straight away, but it's quite quick. I used to think it was 2 hours, but reading up it was a lot less than that.
Yeah, I think that the other thing that the sort of, I suppose, slightly frustrating thing about your foliar feeds is because you're putting down sort of such small amounts as well, you don't tend to see that huge response that you would from a granular feed or a liquid feed, because you're just putting down small amounts to sort of top up. It's hard to say. You look at it and go, I don't know if I've had a response from that. I don't know if I've had the reaction I wanted. It might almost seem like you've lost a fair proportion of it when technically it has been taken up and utilised, but because you're only applying maybe 4 or 5 kgs of N, you're not going to get a huge growth response from it.
And just going back on to the question was asked earlier about the fertiliser as well. If it's granular, without doubt, you want to be applying water straight after that, or do as we do. If you don't have irrigation systems, you literally wait for the rain to come in and then apply the fertiliser before the rain comes in. You don't want to leave the granular fertiliser on the field; it could end up squashing the plant.
Yeah.
Hi Ian, Neil here. Just a question regarding nitrogen and stadium environment. What kind of application rate are we looking at for a year? Is there a maximum? I mean, I know it's discussed quite regularly, but what's your take on that?
Well, I mean, it's something that does get discussed, and it was the question I posed on the first slide is how much N do I apply? It does always sort of boil down to that. The answer is, again, if you're talking a sort of high-end stadium environment, you're probably looking at, if it's a sand-based root zone, you're probably looking at 500 kgs of N as a minimum, but that could be as wide-ranging as 500 up to, because some places are applying over 1,000. It just depends on the intensity of usage, weather conditions and such like. But it can
lights as well.
Sorry, say that, Dean.
Lights and undersoil heating now the plant will absorb more nitrogen if the temperatures are hotter through the lights and the undersoil heating.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at sort of old textbooks, it will tell you that you apply 300 kgs of nitrogen per year as a maximum. The plant can't take up any more than that. I think we're moving on, and technology, as Dean says, lights and undersoil heating. We're growing grass all year round nowadays. I think, and certainly sort of relatively high-end stadium environment, you're looking at kind of 500 kgs as a minimum, certainly in a sand-based root zone.
Any other questions?
I've got one wee one, Dean. I don't, obviously, when you were going through symptoms of I've gone through the symptoms of different deficiencies. We had it was the end of February, the natural soil pitches that have been top dressed with sand over the years. The end of February, we'd had a very wet February. On the plant, half of the plant was greying, half of the plant was healthy green.
Right.
Pretty much down the spine. Have you any ideas on that one? Is that a nutrient thing, or is that?
Was it windy?
Not noticeably.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of lots of kind of different things. Don't forget, if it's raining heavily, that plant is leaching out a lot of nutrients as well, isn't it? So it's not. Yeah. You might need to put on more nutrients than that. Ian, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, it's quite hard to say without sort of having seen it. You know, some was being used at the time. Was it the pitch under sort of relative intensive usage?
So, like, we have 9 rugby pitches, and from a distance you could see the pitch. The pitch was a greying colour, a slightly greying. When you looked at it up close, it was half the plant directly down the spine.
No,
is that consistent across the pitch?
Consistent, There was pockets which were more, which were more, but it was consistent across the whole area.
Would you say those pockets were more in areas where they've been used more often?
No, because there were I've been racking my brain for the last 2 months. I thought I'll ask.
Yeah, right. I mean, because you do get a bit of anthracnose as well, which kind of stress leaf, stress plant, mainly in the high wear areas. You also see it where the machines turn. So I'm just wondering something like that. I mean, without you've obviously do your pH test and get your analysis and things like that. So yeah.
Yeah, the head groundsman gets it done before the fertilising.
Yeah. Some of that might end up giving you some indications, but
no worries. I know it's hard to do it. It's hard to do it without seeing it. I just thought off the top of your head you might.
Yeah. So green through a leaf. I'll have a look into that as well. But
it could potentially even be something mechanical. It could be the mowing equipment itself if it's sort of greying if you're not getting.
I seen it at the last work as well, and I thought that's the exact same thing.
Right. I'd love to see a picture of it. See if you had a picture of it. If you could send that on, I'd love to see it. Maybe share it.
I'll send it by WhatsApp.
Blaine, my number hasn't changed, so yeah, send it across for definite.
Well,
Matt, you're still there. Have you ever come across something like that?
Yeah, it's hard to say without seeing it, because if you can send a couple of pictures of across, that'd be great. What did you spray? Did you spray or put down anything before?
Pardon?
I said, did you do any applications before you saw it?
No.
It just went about.
The areas that were treated, because it was obviously a massive site with 9 pitches within it, but the areas which weren't being, so areas off the pitch also had this as well. So it wasn't as.
What were the weather conditions leading up to that?
January was wet, February was very wet, but I'll have a look through my phone and I'll send it to you on WhatsApp, Dean.
Yeah, cheers, pal. Greg just asked now, is it waterlogging? Was it wet there?
Like it was non-stop rain for February.
Yeah, but was that area flooded?
Heavy.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Possibly that.
I can confirm that, Blair. You're about a kilometre from my house, and there was a lot of rain in February and January. So.
Yeah.
Get through that time.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, any more questions for Ian and Dean before we split? I think it's been pretty productive. It's good to get the discussion going at the end. That's a gold dust. That's what everyone wants. So,
yeah.
Any more questions, fire away. If not, we'll close up for today.
No, all good. I thought it was decent. Cheers, guys.
Yeah. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Right. Thank you very much, Ian. Great presentation, and Dean as well. Thank you. Everyone stay safe, and we'll promote any future webinars a bit more advanced this time. So keep your eye on the social media feeds, and we'll feed out to the registered people from this one and the last one as well. Okay. Cheers, guys. Catch you later.
Take care, everyone. See you later.
Bye, everyone.